It is high noon on the Eastern Seaboard, as they say. So I'm Cyndi Gave from the Metiss Group. We are behavior experts at work. Welcome to our first webinar on how you can maximize virtual interviewing. Welcome to all of you. Many of you we know, several of you we do not. And so for those of you who do not know exactly who the heck we are behavior experts at work. And as such, we introduce processes into the workplace that give you more predictable results around the people part of your business. I founded the business almost exactly 24 years ago in Metro Detroit, and then expanded it about 13 years ago into the Charlotte, North Carolina area. As a result, right now we have about 40% of our clients in the Carolinas, about 20% in the Midwest, and the rest is all over North America. We do have some clients overseas, but all of those will still have a US presence. It's an exciting time for this topic because it means, as I looked at many of the web addresses that several of you had when you registered, you actually are in some of those essential businesses right now that are thriving, and you are trying to do some of this interviewing. I also recognize by some of the people I already know and some people whose email addresses I recognize, we have some real professionals on the line, either because we have search firms or we have some HR professionals who have battled it through the years or the decades. And so when we get to the end for questions and comments, I hope some of those experts will help share as well. When we talk about how to maximize virtual interviewing, we're doing this now because there are so many different things going on. Even before we were faced with the requirements for social distancing, we still were realizing with a crazy unemployment rate for the last 2 years, it was becoming more and more difficult to get everyone together and interview in person when and where we needed them to. I'm hoping this is going to be a little bit of an interactive webinar. So one of the first things I'm going to ask you to do is to take out a device other than your computer. So whether it's your cell phone or an iPad, something else, and go to polev.com/Metiss. First, you have to go to your browser, and then in your browser, please type polev.com/Metiss. There you will find a poll that I'd like you to answer. And I know we have a maximum of 25 people today. Don't know how many are actually on, so we'll see how many respondents we get. So far, we've had one person type in their answer. Wow. So far, 4 respondents. We'll give it a little bit of time as everybody's just finding a way to log in and enter their answers. So for the most part, and we'll come back and forth to this poll, in the event you lost us and weren't able to log in, you'll see again at the top of the screen still polev.com/Metiss. And you want to type that directly into your browser. So you don't want to Google that. You just want to type it into your browser as if you're going directly to that web page. And then you should be able to access any of the polls as we go back and forth. So it looks like we've got some pretty good experts. Out of the respondents we have, 73% have already conducted a phone or a video interview. And so probably many of you are thinking about some of the things you like and dislike about it, depending on how frequently you've done this and how expert you've become. So we're going to go back to our slides at this point and talk about the situation that we have at hand. One of the reasons that we really first started putting this webinar together long before COVID-19 and or coronavirus required us to do some more social distancing is because we needed some more flexibility in hiring and scheduling of interviews. people were far less available. There weren't enough people to go around for the jobs. We were at a 3.5% unemployment rate before this hit. The natural low is 4.5%. So that means anytime we're hiring below the natural low, below 4.5%, we're hiring the unemployable. These are people who, because of physical or emotional or mental limitations, are just not capable of holding full-time jobs. As a result, many of us were spread pretty thin, and to take time away from work to do an interview, either because you were conducting an interview or participating in one as a candidate, was becoming very, very difficult. And so needing to make key hires, trying to have some flexibility. Also, if there was a good candidate available, you knew if you didn't move fast, you were going to lose them in a blink. So it was getting more difficult to interview candidates in person before they got gobbled up someplace. And of course, some of the other challenges that we have right now is finding it difficult to leverage video technologies, or not sure where to begin. The advantage of video interviews we're finding is lots more flexibility, right? It does certainly speed up the selection process, because it's much easier to get people who are in different locations to participate. If they can't participate, one of my favorite things is recording it to make it available for other team members who are not on the call. So you can have somebody who's doing an initial phone screen or doing the actual regular interview, recording it and making it accessible to the other team members who are part of the selection process. Candidates tend to like this as well, because it really cuts down on the exact same question being asked over and over again in subsequent interviews. It does increase candidate pool to out-of-town candidates, or candidates who may even maybe live a half hour away but work an hour away. So to try to get them after work to come in for an interview, or get them to come in early, is logistically very difficult for them. As we think about the advantages of video interviewing, I want you to go back to that pollev.com, and I'd like you to answer the next poll and let us know what you think the biggest advantage for you is to do video interviewing.
This is
Okay, so it looks like flexibility and faster hiring process are leading the way. Trying to reach more candidates or recording for others is not as big of a deal. I'm going to tell you, the recording for others, especially in the last month or two for us, has become, actually, I guess it was two or 3 months ago, has become pretty significant. We just recently hired our EVP of Business Development. And when we were going through the process of bringing Michael on board, we were recording candidates' interviews and phone screens, and that made things really easy. So we weren't taking up too much time of everybody's precious calendars, as we're all overworked, or were at the time, and it allowed us to share only the best candidates' results with everybody else on the team. So again, flexibility was number one. Faster hiring process was 31%. And recording for others is not something that was was a high motivator, but we'll see if that changes by the end of this. It'll be interesting to see. Nope. Sorry, gang. So the advantages of video interviewing we already talked about. We want to make a positive experience for the candidates. So one of the things you want to do is send the link instructions well ahead of time. This is important, and when you do that, make sure you make it clear at least once that this will be a video interview or video phone screen. The second bullet point says provide the candidate expectations that they will be on camera, so they may want to consider how they're dressed, the duration, and that I don't necessarily include the fact that we're recording in the email, and I'll explain that in a second. And I have some caveats on how much of the expectations you want to set for the candidate in advance. Much of that has to do with the position itself. Let me give you an example. When I was interviewing and eventually brought Michael on board as EVP of Business Development, it was for a senior sales role. And we knew that in this role, because we do work all over North America, if not beyond, it was going to be important for the individual with whom we worked to be pretty well familiar with and comfortable with using this technology in the sales experience. So I wanted to see specifically how prepared, how comfortable they were, and I didn't want to give too much information. I wanted to see their attention to detail. I mentioned it a time or two in the subject line, and then in the directions that it was going to be a video conference. And you will be surprised how many times when I brought up the Zoom meeting and had myself visible, and I would say to the candidate, I want to make sure you can both see and hear me. Oh, yes, I can. There was no interest in checking back with me to make sure that I could see them, either because they didn't want it or because they were clueless. Either way, because of the position, that was really important to me. Now, when I was also interviewing for our intern, I took a very different approach. While these folks tended to be more open to learning about technology and maybe not having done this before, I wouldn't necessarily expect that they had a lot of experience with it. And so I was much more happy to explain that a little bit. There were still some people who refused to participate by camera. That doesn't necessarily mean they should not be considered, but it is a data point to keep in the back of your mind, again, depending on the position and depending on how important it is for people to reach out their comfort zones, to be prepared, to explore new avenues of doing things. The only reason I personally tend to avoid telling them about recording in advance is that we know that only 7% of our communication happens through the words we choose. 55% is from body language, eye contact, other emotional expressions, and then 38% is tone of voice, pace of voice, some other articulation techniques. And so if I put in there that I can be recording, no matter how I try to explain it, it may be taken out of context. So I generally wait until we get going, we've exchanged some pleasantries, and then I say, I'd like to have your permission to record this. Assuming all goes well, I'd like to be able to forward this on to other members of our selection team so they can benefit from our communication. It also helps me keep candidates straight, especially if there's something fabulous that you said that I want to recall exactly as you said it. When I presented it that way, there hasn't been the least bit hesitation from anyone to allow me to record. Never. Not even a hesitation, much less someone asking me not to. The camera thing is really interesting, though. There was one person who said that they couldn't get it to work, and they were frustrated because they knew it worked before. So I just kept that as something in the back of my mind. In the phone screen, when we did an interview, they had it working. It wasn't a big deal. There was someone else who clearly didn't want me to see it, and that was a different story. The third bullet point about you being prepared and having both questions and the resume in front of you is critical. It's just as important for the candidate to be prepared as you are. So make sure that they understand this is important to you and that you are prepared for this conversation as well. What responses to look for from the candidates? First of all, were they prepared? Many of you who do work with us know that we use an accountability matrix which is kind of a scorecard for those of you who don't know on the job. It lists out what the accountabilities are for the job, how we expect they're going to spend their time, their priorities, and what the success factors are. How will we know if the individual has done their job well enough to keep it? So when we are scheduling this phone screen, even the very first phone screen, we'll send them a copy of the accountability matrix and tell them we'd like to schedule a preliminary 20-minute or 30-minute conversation with them to discuss this accountability matrix. So when I begin the conversation and I ask folks, I want to make sure that you received it and you had a chance to look it over. Without exception, everyone says, oh, yes, of course I looked it over. Okay, let me know what questions you have or what thoughts you have about it. Crickets. More than half the time, even at the executive sales level, I was getting people who were completely ill-prepared. I had one person actually say to me, well, I was hoping you could tell me more about it. Another person said, well, I thought that's what we were going to discuss now. And I said, yes, I was hoping you reviewed it in some detail and had some questions. But those people who were not prepared enough, I simply said, you know, I appreciate your interest in the position, but as I explained in the email, the whole purpose of this call was to discuss that job. And if you are prepared to discuss it, I'm not sure it makes sense for us to continue on in this conversation. The next thing you want to look for is, do they make eye contact? You should be visible, they should be visible. That should be something that they can do. Were there appropriate pauses before answering, not too long or not too quickly? So the appropriate pauses is, again, think about it relative to the job. If you are hiring for a job that is requiring an introverted person, they typically will listen to your question, process it for a moment or two, and then give you a very well-considered response. So a little bit of a pause is expected. That deadly radio silence that goes on for 10 seconds or more is not necessarily useful because even if they are an introvert, they haven't really learned to adapt, and that, depending on the position, could be an issue. If they are an extrovert, we typically expect they are going to be much quicker to respond. Now, it is not uncommon for some extroverts to be so quick to respond, you don't have a chance to actually fully complete your question before they're interrupting with their response. Sometimes that shows a lot of excitement and engagement. Other times it can be annoying because they're not really listening to the question that's asked. And you need to think about, again, as yet just another data point, is this going to be a problem later on down the line? And were they able to navigate the technology? We tend to use Zoom because it is not difficult. I refer to it as being Cyndi proof. We'll talk a little bit more about it a little bit later. But if you have a platform that you think is pretty easy and they're not able to navigate the technology, that might be an issue. I love the fact that with Zoom, I will get an email when someone has logged in for the scheduled meeting. So even if the meeting is tomorrow at 3 o'clock, and I realize tonight that somebody wants to be prepared and they go in there just to make sure that they can do the login and check everything out, I get an email from Zoom saying, hey, they're already logged in. I think, wonderful, they're actually prepared, they're checking this out. It's a great sign. And then, did they choose a professional setting? My gosh, when I was interviewing or doing the phone screen with Michael, the first thing I did when I concluded the session was I jumped out of my chair and I ran into John, who's my business and marital partner, and I ran into his office and I said, John, I'm so excited. It was such a professional setting. This guy is clearly a professional salesperson. He's used to doing sales from his home office. He was dressed in a jacket and tie. He had diplomas behind him. He had a bookshelf. It was a very professional setting. The very next day, I had another candidate that I was interviewing who I can only describe as being a complete hot mess. She actually had a cork board behind her that was probably a 2x2 cork board, and I believe it probably included every piece of paper she accumulated over the last several years and some other mementos, including a New Orleans Mardi Gras mask that was connected there. And it was so distracting. It had all of these papers just hammered on this thing that as she was talking, I couldn't focus on her answers. I was trying to figure out everything behind her. And so even if it's an individual who's working out of their dorm room for just now, or they are in their kitchen, they're clearly looking for a place that is not distracting and it's as professional as it can be. But again, you want to think about it relative to the position at hand. So we're going to go back to poll EV, poll everywhere. And what do you look for when you are video interviewing? Preparedness is a big deal. Eye contact is some. Response is only a little. I would encourage you to really consider introverts and extroverts, just simply that. I'm not trying to make you a behavior expert, but when you think about, do I really want to be an introvert or an extrovert for this particular role, then think about introverts and extroverts you know, and think about how they typically respond to things. You will be surprised how much clearer a picture you can get really early on in the process as to whether or not this is likely to be the right type of person for the position. One of our clients in Rochester, Michigan, one of our very, very first clients, which is a software development company, it was actually one of the .coms that made it, got to be phenomenally good at this interviewing. And I remember one candidate I asked them about, and I said, what did you think about this person? They seemed to have tons of technical expertise. And they said, no, we knew it wasn't going to work. They answered the questions too fast. And it was for a high-level developer, and it was in quality control, and they knew they needed a very, very high introvert with a high attention to detail who was very systemic, and this was never going to be somebody who was interrupting questions to jump in and give their answers. And they had learned over some years of interviewing and perfecting some of their skills that this was just going to be a disaster. So I'm not saying that you should use that as a go, no-go right up front unless you've become very expert at this, but start looking for some of those things and you'll be surprised. The technology comfort is something that's also going to become more and more important. As we're all working from home, as we're sheltering in place and practicing social distancing, we're all having to practice this technology comfort a little bit more and trying out lots of different technologies. We may tend to use Zoom, somebody else may use Skype or FaceTime or GoToMeeting or whatever. And so depending on who's inviting you to the meeting, you need to be able to be prepared for that. And the extent to which someone can flex with that is important. Many years ago, we used to say that IQ was critical in making a hire. Not that it's not important now, but it migrated from being IQ being important to EQ being important, which is the emotional quotient. And now people are talking about AQ, which is the adaptability quotient. Well, the ability for someone to adapt to the technology is something that you may very well want to consider, again, depending on the culture of the organization and the position for which you're hiring. Move along from here. So why we use Zoom? Initially, one of the things that made us change from GoToMeeting to Zoom, and it may no longer be a problem, although I heard somebody a couple of weeks ago say that it was still a problem for them with GoToMeeting. One of the things we like with Zoom is that you can communicate as if you're communicating a conversation. So the both of you can talk at the same time and generally hear each other. There can be a little snafu here or there, but generally speaking, that's the way it works. In the old days, at least with GoToMeeting, we used to have issues with one person talking and the other person couldn't chime in and even ask a question until the first person came up for air. That could sometimes present issues. It wasn't as conversational. That's changed for the most part, we believe, although I did hear somebody complaining about it just 2 weeks ago. Zoom is very easy to use on either a computer or a mobile device. Again, because people are working in so many different locations, even when we all get to go back to work again, or we're working from different places, sometimes it isn't convenient to do this from your computer. So somebody may be taking their cell phone and going to their car to take the interview. Or we had one person take the interview in a stairwell on their mobile device or a phone screen on a stairwell. And so if it's something that can flex depending on the device, that's certainly going to be helpful as people are trying to get creative in their work environments. There are both free and inexpensive versions available. And again, we talked a little bit earlier about the recording and the scheduling are something that seem to work very, very well for us. We're going to go back to Poll EV, Poll Everywhere. What video software does your company use or have they used in the past? If you're going to use 2 words, you're going to want to put those 2 words together or use a hyphen or it'll split it up. Lots of different ones. Adobe, Microsoft Teams, I'm guessing those 2 words went together. Google Hangouts. Zoom. If you're familiar with word clouds, you know that the bigger the word gets, the more people are chiming in with that response. Teams. Zoom keeps getting bigger. Adobe GoToMeeting, Skype, Zoom, Teams, thoughts. And then of course we had some respondents who were not doing video interviewing yet, so I'm assuming those folks have not responded. So good to know, lots of different options out there. It may be worth exploring some and testing them out. You know, we all have to practice social distancing, so practice them out now and see which ones are kind of your favorites, especially when it comes to the interviewing, because you want to make it easy for someone who isn't using it all the time to access it. So some of the common questions that we run into. Should I expect a candidate to use the camera? Generally speaking, yes. If they tell you in advance why that is an issue or why they're having a difficult time making that work, again, I would just store that in the back of your head, and I would also consider it relative to the position at hand. Again, when I was looking for the salesperson, this was pretty critical. So I would say it is important. Most devices these days can accommodate a camera, but it's personal preference. Should I expect the candidate to dress appropriately? Oh God, yes. You know, it's like any other interview. You know, we have some clients who have very unskilled laborers that still do phone screens this way. And even if they're working on an assembly line, they still would expect if somebody were coming in person for an interview, they'd wear khakis and a golf shirt or something like that, or even very, very clean jeans and a golf shirt. So if somebody's wearing some, you know, rock t-shirt and a hoodie, that may or may not be appropriate for you. It certainly was something that I paid attention to when I was interviewing for the sales position again. The one woman I described as being a hot mess, I had actually met her earlier. She was introduced to me. She was a referral, and I met her in a different environment. She had her hair pulled back. She was quite professional. She was quite engaging. And in this phone screen, she just had her hair everywhere. So in addition to the poster board or the cork board behind her, her hair was just everywhere, and she had to keep brushing it out of her eyes, and everything was just distracting. So not just dressing, but are they prepared? You know, is the makeup appropriate? Are the accessories appropriate? Are they otherwise engaged? Are they distracted? Can you tell they're multitasking? Any of those things are important. Are there any differences between the video screen and the interview? I think there are some. The video phone screen, really the sole purpose of the video phone screen, if you are following our Select Advantage process, is to figure out whether or not you like this person well enough to send them the core values email exercise, which comes before you decide whether or not to bring them in for a face-to-face interview or do a video interview. So the video phone screen is simply going to be making sure they understand your accountability matrix or the job at hand, making sure you go over every position on their resume to say, why did you leave? You know, what was your favorite thing you did at this job? What was your least favorite thing? And why did you leave? Because why they will tell you they leave when you are face-to-face, whether it's in person or via video, is very different oftentimes than what little explanation they will put in that small box on an application. So I always ask all of those things and get the resume stuff out of the way. Maybe one or two behavior-based interview questions. The regular interview will follow after the core values email exercise, and that's where we're going to go deep dive into the behavioral characteristics that are really required in the job. So if we have benchmarked the job for you, where we built out the accountability matrix and created the avatar, the job profile, and the interview guide for what the ideal person would look like to do that job within the culture of your firm, then you know you have the interview questions for all the personal skills, the behavior style, and the workplace motivators that are critical to that job. And you should be asking one or two questions from each of those categories. If you do not have that information in front of you, you want to think about some of the characteristics you believe will make or break somebody in a particular role. And behavior-based interview questions are based on the premise that past performance is a better predictor of future performance than anything else. So you'll ask for someone to give you an example of a time they did X, or describe a situation when. Even if they respond with, well, usually or generally, you can say, I appreciate that, but I'd really like to have you give me a specific explanation or a specific example. And the reason is most candidates, most humans cannot make up details on the fly. Yeah, a psychotic or two may slip through, but for the most part, the normal humans can't make them up. And as they're telling you those specific examples, you're actually paying more attention. So you're listening to stories, and your follow-up probing questions are going to be far more telling. And you want to know exactly what they did. Even if things didn't work out perfectly, they'll chime in and say, so I know next time I need to do X. But if you ask people what they would do in a certain situation, the what if scenarios, you're actually asking people what they should do. And most of us know what we should do in any given situation, but I've never met anybody who always does what they're supposed to do. So there's a little bit of a difference in the intention of the interview than the phone screen. We'll add one or two behavior-based interview questions into the video phone screen. For the Metiss Group, one of our big deals is personal accountability. We know nobody's perfect, but we need to know when something goes not as planned, so we can decide how to fix it moving forward. So we'll always ask the question to give us an example of a time you had to admit you made a mistake, and how did you handle it? And if they can't get through that sometimes they'll say, oh, I can't think of anything. And we just try to give them a second or two to come up with it. If not, we'll ask that question again in the interview. And if they still can't come up with it, we're likely going to pass. More like that one's a deal breaker for us. We know that if somebody is an individual who's always making excuses or blaming others, not taking personal accountability, it's never going to work in our firm. So that's something that we use right up front. And it's amazing when you ask the question, the different variations you can hear when someone really isn't taking personal accountability. They'll use those general statements because they can't come up with a specific example, or there's a specific example they really don't want to share. So as y'all are going through all of this, again, many of you I saw by your web email addresses are in situations where you're in essential businesses. Many of you are in those businesses where you are working in healthcare, or you are working to build healthcare and hospital facilities. And so you may not have enough staff on board to help with some of this. We can make a difference. We've done over 5,000 virtual interviews. We've evaluated over 10,000 candidates with a suite of assessments that are quite unique, and over 2,000 successful hires. Our team is prepared to help with some of the job definitions up front, or can help even on an hourly basis as you need assistance in getting through some of these video interviewing if you are not prepared to do these on your own, or you just don't have enough time in a day. So we're going to go back to pollev.com. And the last poll here is ways for you to stay connected. When we get done with this, we're going to go to our questions. So don't go anywhere. I'm sure there are going to be questions out there, but if you'd like to stay in touch with us or you need one of us to follow up, you can continue to access this code. And I'm going to go over to the questions and be prepared so that any of you who have some questions out there will be happy to answer those as we can, and then we'll be ready to wrap up. I'm going to go to a black screen so people who have submitted questions can retain their anonymity, and I don't want to show all those questions out there. So bear with me as I do some adjustment here, and I'm adjusting to some new technology myself. All right, let's go to our Q&A. So our first question is around whether or not the technology thing is a no-brainer. So the technology thing should be a no-brainer. That's not necessarily the case. That is something that most people, you would think by now, are familiar with trying to do some things virtually. A lot of people would be prepared to do things by phone, but not necessarily by video. It's okay if they ask questions up front, but if they don't ask questions and they're ill-prepared and wait until the moment they're trying to log on and they're late for logging on or whatever, just because they're unfamiliar, I would, again, use that as a data point. Our next question is, what is an accountability matrix? Great question. An accountability matrix is the foundation for our selection process, where we bring together the stakeholders of the job. And we start with a brain dump. It's much more dynamic. It's much more telling than a job description, and starts with just all the activities that an individual is going to be expected to do. There's a little bit of a break, and then we put them into 3 to 5 accountability buckets, and then create priorities, percentage of time, and success factors, which is the measurables on how we'll know whether or not someone has done their job well enough to keep it. If you go to the metissgroup.com, you will be able to see our services, and if you click on selection, you will be able to see a sample of the accountability matrix and our select advantage process as you scroll through there. Our next question is, what is the recommended duration of an interview? Great question, Eric. The recommended duration is generally around 90 minutes, 60 to 90 minutes, depending on the position. If you're asking some well-rounded questions, behavior-based interview questions, and somebody's giving you some great examples, it's easy to think about that. Because think about it, the first 10 minutes, you're welcoming somebody on board, getting them a glass of water, how are you, making some great comments about their core values email exercise, asking if they had additional questions about the accountability matrix or the job description, and then you're going to ease into some of the other things. There's also going to be some selling of the organization. Assuming once we get through this craziness around the coronavirus and we go back to normal, people have gotten really particular about the companies for whom they're working. And so making sure that they're getting to know the organization is going to be important. But keep in mind that we really only have, only want the interviewer talking 20 to 30% of the time. So you should be having the candidate talk a good 70% of the time, and you'll need to build that in. So if you feel like you need to pitch the organization and take them for a tour, it's certainly going to extend the interview. What are your top 3 initial screening questions? You know, Dawn, that's a really good question, and I think a lot of that depends on the particular role, but for the Metiss Group, and it all depends on the culture of the company. I think it also depends on the position, but for the Metiss Group, The personal accountability question I shared earlier is one of my top ones. My other one is, give me an example of a time you had to comply with a policy with which you didn't necessarily agree, because they don't know if I'm looking for someone who challenges the status quo or is going to protect the status quo, and depending on the position, that may change. I also like asking them to describe for me their favorite supervisors and their least favorite supervisors, and trying to hear whether or not their least favorite supervisors really sounds a lot like me before I hire them. We already answered the question about how much time is appropriate for a virtual interview. The phone screens generally are 20 to 30 minutes. You can weed out a lot of duds that way. Quite frankly, even at the executive sales level, I was weeding out many. I probably weeded out 40% of them in the first 10 minutes because they were just ill prepared and I wasn't going to waste their time or mine. I was gracious about it. I wasn't, but why waste their time or mine if they really weren't that interested? Lots of questions about the difference for time planned in the interviews versus in-person interviews. I don't know that there's much of a difference in how much time is required for in-person interviews versus virtual interviews, except that in-person interviews may include touring somebody around your facility if that's important, and showing off your offices if you think that's a plus. Are there circumstances where the one person would be doing the interview? Yes, absolutely. And, you know, we didn't spend a little bit more time on the recording. I've never had, as I said earlier, I've never had anyone refuse to allow me, or even hesitate, like not a blink when I ask them if I can record. So if one person's doing the interview and you've recorded it, and now you can share it with other members of your selection team before going on to deciding to have because usually after the first interview, you'll do assessments on the candidate, and then you'll do performance checks before you guys fall in love, and then bring them in for the second interview. And in that second interview, you may be doing it in person, or maybe having multiple people doing a virtual interview if we're still social distancing. But if you're doing just a one-person interview, it's fine if you're recording it, because even you as the interviewer can go back if you inadvertently missed things, or the other members of your team can participate, and that's really huge. Next question is, what are some tips to give someone a view of your culture virtually? Gosh, that's a really good question. To give someone a view of your culture virtually, I guess I would ask them first to think about some core values email exercise they'll do at the end of the phone screen, and tell them we'll do more of a deeper dive into our culture from an exploratory perspective in the interview. But I love telling a story or two about our culture, whether it's our purpose or some of our core values. You know, with the unemployment rate being as tight as it was, we were limiting the core values email exercise to 3 core values. So while the Metiss Group has 5, we would say, you know, we know times are tough, and you have a lot of things on your mind, and so we want to make sure that you have you're not being overburdened by this. So please answer number 2, 3, and 5. So I could easily give examples of 1 and 4 and not really be prompting them or coaching them for any of the other things that they should be doing. You could also walk around your facility with your laptop and show them some people. What's really cool for them to see is, as you're just walking around, how people happen to glance up and automatically perk into a smile. And that gives them a great cue of what the culture is, just for them to see some of that stuff. Are there circumstances where more than one person would be doing the interview? Oh, absolutely. Team interviews are good. I like pairing first and introverts and an extrovert. Introverts tend to be great listeners. Extroverts do a better job of shepherding somebody through the process. But when you have joint interviews, the 2 interviewers two or more interviewers must plan that in advance. Decide who's going to ask which questions, how are you going to structure it so you don't seem like clods stumbling and clumbling through the process. What are your steps for a full selection process? Great question. You can again go to themetissgroup.com and look at the services and go to selection, or you can simply go to selectionprocess.com and you can see our selection process there. We'd be happy to share that with you. There are some examples of things that can be done along the way, including the assessments that we use. Keep in mind, for those of you who aren't familiar with us, if you do use assessments, we really encourage that, because any good assessment will help you figure out where to have better conversations. But we really encourage you to use multiple sciences. If you're only using a single science, it can lead you down paths and lead you to make decisions that may or may not be completely accurate. So the more questions that you can introduce from different sciences, the better. I liken it to, if you went into the doctor with a sore arm and he took your temperature and he said, oh, you broke your arm, you'd look at him and say, you can't tell that with a thermometer, right? They can tell if you have an infection from a broken arm because your temperature's elevated, but they might have to do a blood test, they might have to do an MRI, they might have to do an x-ray. There's multiple diagnostics that they would have to use to get the full picture, and the same is true if we're going to be responsible in our diagnosis. Are there certain positions or position types that a virtual interview is not recommended for? I'm sure there probably are, Stephen. I'm not sure. There isn't one that comes to mind. We recommend phone screens even for people who are going to be working on an assembly line. We have clients who work on an assembly line where they're working in a slaughterhouse or doing some other things that are far more sophisticated, working in a science lab, researching drugs that treat obscure forms of cancer. And so, we've got clients in both aspects. When you think about the fact that most of our clients are still English speaking, this is our clients anyway, are English speaking entities. If someone cannot communicate well enough to understand safety regulations and instructions, then that's going to be an issue, and at least a phone screen is going to be important for that. And let's see, it looks like our last question, would two people doing video interview of a candidate be appropriate? Yeah, I think we already answered that one. So long as you coordinate that in advance, it does need to be choreographed. You'll get better at it the more the two of you do this over time. If you're using one of our interview guides following a job benchmark, this becomes much easier because you can divvy it up by topic. So if somebody's digging into the personal accountability questions and somebody else is looking into results orientation, and the guy who wanted personal accountability also wants to focus on the high utilitarian, and someone else wants to focus on a different area, then they're attentive to those types of answers no matter which question is being asked. And the most robust discussions after the interview can be amazing as you're evaluating candidates and determining which ones work best. Again, keep in mind, if this is all new to you, we're happy to help either to do it for you, or we've frequently done it with our clients where they shadow us. We can actually do it with them where they're just on the phone as an observer, or on the video as an observer. They may chime in with an additional probing question, but one of our senior advisors can expertly navigate you through the phone screen or the phone interview and help you get more comfortable with it until you're prepared to do that on your own. So any of those are options, or we can even script it for you if you feel that if we benchmark the job anyway, it's easier for us to script the interview for you and help you figure out which questions to ask and how to move through the interview. I thank you all for being so interactive and so attentive. We've spent about 50 minutes together. Of course, we're happy to continue conversations if you'd like to individually. You have our contact information. Feel free to email me at Cyndi, CYNDI, at themetissgroup.com. The Metiss is METISS, that's 1 T, 2 S's, group.com. Or you can get to us from our website. We'd be happy to continue further conversation. And I'm looking forward to hearing how beneficial this is. And I'd love to hear success stories. So as you try some of these things out, please send us some notes and let us know what's worked for you. Have a great day.